Hey guys, tonight we begin with the absolute unit known as Homo neanderthalensis, the brawny, brainy and often misunderstood cousins of ours who didn't just survive the Ice Age, they practically bench-pressed it. From their freakish strength to their surprisingly rich culture, Neanderthals weren't just cavemen, they were nature's gym rats with a flair for interior decorating. Before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If you walked into Ice Age Europe about 80,000 years ago, you'd probably freeze solid within 30 seconds. But before that happened, you might just catch a glimpse of a Neanderthal, the local apex hominin, and possibly the only creature on Earth that looked like it could win a wrestling match with a mammoth. Neanderthals weren't just different from us, they were optimised for punishment. Imagine a human designed by a committee of bodybuilders, Arctic engineers and someone who really liked forehead real estate. That's your Neanderthal. Let's start with the body. They were shorter than us, averaging around 5 feet 4 inches to 5 feet 6 inches, but calling them short is misleading. They weren't small, they were compressed power. Stocky builds, massive rib cages, wide shoulders, and frames so sturdy they looked like their skeletons had been reinforced for demolition work. Their bones were thick, dense, and frankly overqualified for anything less than full contact mammoth takedowns. Their limbs were short but powerful, were perfect for conserving heat in the brutal cold. Their hands were huge, with strong thumbs built for crafting tools, gripping prey, or opening pickle jars that modern humans wouldn't even attempt. And the face. Neanderthals didn't look weird. We look weird. Their skulls were long and low with brow ridges that could have doubled as ski jumps. Their noses were large and forward-facing, acting like built-in heaters for frigid Ice Age air. Powerful jaws, nearly non-existent chins, and expressions that always seemed halfway between mildly confused and ready for a fight. But make no mistakes, these weren't brutish thugs or failed experiments. They were a parallel success story, perfectly tailored to their world. And in that world, they thrived. Neanderthals were the endurance athletes of their age. If that age involved ice storms, cave bears, and hunting dinner with a sharpened stick, every inch of them said, "Yes, I've broken several ribs, and no, I don't regret it." If you've ever felt proud lifting a milk jug without pulling a muscle, sit down. Neanderthals were walking fortresses. Their skeletons weren't just sturdy, they were medieval architecture sturdy. Bones so thick they make modern human femurs look like discount chopsticks. Their legs were short and unbelievably robust. Designed not for running marathons, but for powering through mountains while carrying half a reindeer on one shoulder. Their knees were shaped for endless bending and squatting, perfect for a lifestyle of building fires, shaping tools, or butchering massive carcasses. Their arms, just as terrifying. Upper arms thick as logs, forearms even thicker. The kind of build meant for hauling prey, not flexing on Instagram. If modern humans are Swiss Army knives, Neanderthals were jackhammers with eyebrows. Even their rib cages told a story, and wide and flaring, giving room for huge little lungs built for cold oxygen thin air. Basically, their respiratory system was the Ice Age equivalent of industrial bellows. More oxygen in, more mammoth-chasing energy out. And their skulls, magnificent reinforced masterpieces. Long, heavy, with space for massive muscles. They could probably chew frozen venison without blinking. Of course, that strength came with a cost. They matured faster and may have lived shorter lives, but every year was packed with fractures, bruises and battle scars, like they were starring in a prehistoric action movie. Now, let's address the big, brainy elephant in the room. Neanderthals had huge brains, literally. Their brain size averaged between 1,350 and 1,500 cubic centimetres, actually bigger than ours. So the so-called brutes were walking around with high-performance cranial engines and without a single spreadsheet to suffer through. But before you hand them honorary PhDs, a caveat. Bigger doesn't always mean smarter. A blue whale has a massive brain and still hasn't invented indoor plumbing. That said, Neanderthals weren't lugging around useless grey matter. They used it. Much of their brain was dedicated to sensory and motor processing, essential when your daily routine involves stalking elk in a snowstorm and not walking off a cliff. Their visual cortex was particularly large, probably giving them incredible eyesight. Imagine frost-covered Neanderthals squinting dramatically into the blizzard, like Ice Age anime protagonists, but with more fur and fewer speeches. And while their prefrontal cortex, the let's think before we do this part, might have been smaller proportionally, their behaviour showed planning, cooperation and creativity. They painted caves, crafted ornaments and even used ochre pigments, possibly early makeup. So yes, your ancient Neanderthal aunt might have invented contouring long before TikTok did. Neanderthals adapted across vast regions, from dry steppe to frozen tundra, showing serious cognitive flexibility. They learned to use local resources, build shelters, make tools, and occasionally invent new ways to injure themselves with flint. Still not impressed? For years we thought their art and tools were copied from early modern humans, until we found Neanderthal cave paintings older than anything Homo sapiens made in the area. Turns out, we were just late to the cave party. If nature held a survive the worst conditions imaginable contest, Neanderthals would have won, and probably taken the trophy home just to use it as a hammer. These hominins weren't just adapted to the Ice Age, they were engineered for it. Picture the kind of weather that makes your nose hairs freeze. Now imagine living in that, without heaters, hoodies, or the faintest idea of what hot cocoa is. That was Neanderthal territory. Their bodies were short and stocky, not by accident, but by design. That compact build helped them conserve body heat, which is exactly what you want when your surroundings look like the freezer aisle of a cursed supermarket. Long, lanky limbs lose heat fast. Neanderthals had limbs so thick and short that penguins would have nodded in approval. And those noses, massive. Not for sniffing out gossip, but for survival. Their large nasal cavities warmed and humidified icy air before it hit their lungs. Nature's built-in AC system. A useful adaptation, and a solid excuse for having a face you could rest a brick on. Even their skin likely played a role in their cold weather mastery. While exact pigmentation is unknown, most scientists agree they probably had lighter skin to synthesize vitamin D in low light conditions. Because if you're going to survive 6 months of perpetual gloom, you'd better know how to wring sunshine out of a grey sky. Their lungs were probably enormous, necessary to fuel bodies that worked overtime climbing, hunting, hauling, carving, and occasionally discovering new ways to pull a muscle. That wide, barrel-shaped chest wasn't for show. It was a prehistoric furnace. And clothing, yes, they had it. Contrary to popular belief, they weren't running around in fur loincloths unless they were really into that look. Evidence shows they wore stitched hides to stay insulated. And stitching means planning, tool-making, and the concept of winterwear versus slightly less winterwear. In short, Neanderthals weren't just scraping by in the Ice Age, they were thriving in it. They weren't nature's underdogs, they were nature's mole ploughs, trudging through the cold, grunting softly, and wondering why mammoths were always so dramatic about it. When you think of Neanderthal fashion, you might picture a single fur tossed over one shoulder, held up by a vine, accessorized with a club and a lack of self-awareness. But real Neanderthal clothing? Surprisingly sophisticated. Primitive, yes, but practical, functional, and chaotic enough to make a medieval tailor weep. Let's be honest, Ice Age Europe wasn't the place to try minimalist fashion. If you stepped outside wearing nothing but optimism and vibes, you'd freeze solid before you could say saber-toothed mistake. So Neanderthals got smart. They didn't just drape themselves in animal hides like couch covers, they processed and softened them, then stitched them together using bone needles. That's right, they were hand-sewing mammoth skin outfits before buttons even existed. And they didn't complain about it on Reddit. And yes, they accessorized. Some Neanderthal sites contain eagle talons, pierced shells and beads. Items with a little practical purpose which suggests they enjoyed a bit of flair. Maybe symbolism, maybe status. Maybe just Ice Age swagger. Picture a Neanderthal strolling into camp like yes, this claw necklace is real. Yes, I caught the bird myself. No, you can't touch it. They also used ochre, a red pigment. On tools, bodies and possibly faces, was it war paint, decoration, a social signal? We may never know, but at some point a Neanderthal definitely looked at a red rock and said, "This would look incredible on my cheekbones." Were they ready for Fashion Week? Not unless the runway was covered in snow and lit by firelight. But their clothes worked, warm, mostly dry and protective against both the weather and judgmental Homo sapiens. And don't overlook the practicality. Every outfit was biodegradable, locally sourced and cruelty-based, because, well, hunting. Sustainable Ice Age fashion at its finest. Neanderthals weren't just strong, they were punch a woolly rhino in the face strong. The kind of strength that makes you question whether physics operated differently back then, or if they just had a natural gym membership to the universe. Everything about their anatomy screamed power. Their muscle mass was enormous, to shoulders, arms, legs, all built for hurling spears, skinning animals, and maybe moving boulders for fun. Their bones could probably support a small siege engine, which meant those muscles weren't decorative. They were fully functional gains. So how strong were they really? Estimates suggest a Neanderthal male could be up to 50% stronger than a modern human of the same size, and in upper body strength possibly double. This wasn't farm strong or dad strong. This was accidentally rip the door off your cave strong. They didn't just hunt from a safe distance. No, Neanderthals preferred up-close combat, sprinting toward massive, angry Ice Age megafauna and jabbing them with spears at near point-blank range. Dinner prep meant dodging tusks while holding on to something that very much wanted them dead. And the wear and tear tells the story. Their fossils show countless healed injuries, broken arms, crushed ribs, fractured skulls, proof they weren't just strong but absurdly resilient. If a Neanderthal broke a bone, they probably wrapped it in moss, shrugged, and went back to hunting. Even their grip strength was outrageous. Some researchers believe a Neanderthal could crush a modern human's hand without trying. Bigger thumbs, broader fingers, and knuckles designed for damage, usually reserved for medieval weapons. If you're picturing the Rock, but hairier, colder, and more likely to throw a stone axe at you, you're on the right track. If Neanderthal fossils tell us one thing, it's that these people lived hard. Not forgot sunscreen hard. More like tackled a raging bison before lunch hard. Their skeletons read less like calm prehistoric memoirs and more like accident reports from an Ice Age rodeo. And that's not an exaggeration. When scientists examine Neanderthal trauma patterns, they notice something oddly familiar. The injuries, broken ribs, smashed arms, crushed faces, looked almost identical to those found in professional rodeo riders. Turns out if you regularly wrestle one-ton animals for a living, your bones tell a very specific kind of story. Take Shanidar, for example. This poor guy suffered a blow to the head that crushed part of his skull, likely leaving him partially blind. He also had a withered right arm, probably from an old fracture that healed badly, and a damaged foot. In short, he was the prehistoric equivalent of a walking before photo in an orthopedic ad. Yet he survived for years after those injuries, which means other Neanderthals took care of him. Apparently, even if you were a tank of a man with one working eye and a limp, your Ice Age buddies still saved you a seat by the fire. Another case, Le Chapelle-aux-Saints was an older male with severe arthritis, missing teeth and spinal problems, and once again clearly cared for by his group. So not only were Neanderthals getting injured in ways that would terrify modern OSHA inspectors, but they were also helping each other recover, physically and emotionally. Neanderthals said, "Yeah, we do both." But the frequency of these injuries also tells us something about their lifestyle. These weren't people who hunted small game from a safe distance. They got up close and personal with danger. Their main weapons were thrusting spears, Think stab rather than throw. And when you hunt that way, the animal usually fights back. So the next time you trip over a rug and feel sorry for yourself, remember, Neanderthals spent their lives wrestling Ice Age death machines, patched themselves up with moss and fire, and still lived long enough to invent personal grooming. Now that's resilience. Neanderthals didn't just survive the Ice Age, they brought fire to it, which is basically the prehistoric version of saying, "Not today, Satan." They weren't out there inventing s'mores or throwing fireballs, but they absolutely knew how to make, maintain, and even weaponize fire, in ways that would make a caveman version of Bear Grylls nod in approval. How do we know this? Archaeological sites show clear evidence of hearths, centralized fire pits with charred bones, heated stones, and layers of ash built up over years in the same spot. That's not a random wildfire. That's a Neanderthal choosing a cozy spot, building a fire, and cooking dinner beside it, probably glaring at the wind the whole time. The leading theory is that they use flint and pyrite, striking them together to create sparks that could ignite dry grass or moss. No matches, no lighters, no YouTube tutorials, and just raw determination and a suspicious pile of rocks. The Ice Age version of Hold My Beer. They didn't just use fire for warmth either. Fire helped them cook food, which made it easier to chew and digest. That wasn't just a culinary upgrade, it unlocked more nutrients, reduced parasites, and gave them extra time to invent other essentials like gossip. Fire also improved tool making. Heating flint made it easier to shape into tools, meaning Neanderthals were doing a bit of thermal engineering long before humans figured out how to form pointless committees. And of course, fire offered protection. Predators feared it. Sitting around a fire meant warmth, light, and a glowing barrier against whatever growled in the dark. Picture a group of Neanderthals roasting meat, swapping stories and casting long, intimidating shadows on cave walls. Fire was their home security system. Were they the first to discover fire? Probably not. But they mastered it in a steady, practical, and impressively chill way. They didn't flaunt it, they just quietly turned freezing caves into homes and made meat slightly less chewy. Neanderthals didn't have multi-tools, screwdrivers, or YouTube how-tos. But give them a chunk of flint and a little patience, and they could whip up a toolkit that could skin a deer, build a shelter, and maybe even open a medieval wine bottle. Their tools weren't just sharp rocks. They were carefully crafted instruments made with precision, purpose, and just the right amount of controlled violence. Their primary technique, the Levallois method, was a complex multi-step process that involved preparing a stone core so flakes could be removed in predictable shapes. In other words, they weren't banging rocks together like toddlers. They planned ahead, shaping cores, studying angles, and making cuts so precise that modern archaeologists sometimes mistake their work for that of early Homo sapiens, which must be mildly infuriating. Their toolkit included scrapers, points, awls, borers, and even hafted tools, blades attached to wooden shafts using tree resin and sinew. That's not just make sharp thing, that's prehistoric composite engineering, basically ancient duct tape, only harder to invent. They used these tools for everything: butchering meat, tanning hides, woodworking, and probably the occasional angry gesture. And honestly, anyone who figures out how to glue stone to stick using tree goo and patience deserves a TED talk. Tool designs varied by region too, which means Neanderthals weren't just copying each other, they were innovating, adapting their methods to local materials, climates, and prey. One group might prefer limestone, another flint. Some even experimented with bone and antler. It was like prehistoric Etsy, and they weren't afraid of upgrades. Over time, their tools became more refined, efficient, and, let's face it, deadlier. That wasn't just evolution. That was skill and practice. When most people picture Neanderthals, they imagine grunting figures hunched by a fire, club in hand, dinner still twitching. But archaeology paints a richer picture. One where the same people who could dismember a reindeer in 5 minutes also took the time to decorate a shell or bury a loved one with flowers. Yes, Neanderthals had culture, and not just the kind that grows on old meat. Multiple sites show intentional burials, often in shallow pits. sometimes with grave goods or traces of pollen, suggesting flowers were placed with the dead. Whether that was spiritual, symbolic, or just a prehistoric he liked plants, we may never know, but the point is, they cared, they mourned. They didn't just toss grandma behind a boulder and move on. And then there's the art. For years, people assumed Neanderthals didn't make art. That was supposed to be our thing. But then scientists found cave paintings in Spain made with red ochre over 64,000 years ago. Spoiler, that's before modern humans even arrived in Europe. That awkward silence you hear, that's anthropology professors re-evaluating everything they once said with confidence. Neanderthals also collected decorative objects, pierced shells, feathers, eagle talons, items that served no clear practical purpose unless they were secretly inventing cosplay. Some of these objects might have been used as ornaments, ritual pieces, or social symbols. Either way, they weren't just about surviving, they cared about meaning. There's even a mysterious cave structure in France, deep underground, made from broken stalagmites arranged into rings. No sunlight, no graffiti, no obvious function. Just Neanderthals 176,000 years ago, building something in the dark like they were summoning an ancient deity, or just being weird. Who knows? And we can't forget language. They had a hyoid bone, crucial for speech, and genes related to language processing. So while they may not have been writing poetry, it's safe to say they weren't just grunting. Somewhere a Neanderthal looked at another and said something meaningful, probably about meat, but still meaningful. Now let's address what everyone's really curious about. Yes, Neanderthals and modern humans did get together, romantically, biblically, and, well, DNA testably. When early Homo sapiens migrated into Europe and Asia around 60,000 years ago, they met the locals, the Neanderthals, and rather than treating them like distant cousins at a wedding, they went for the evolutionary equivalent of texting you up with zero irony. We know this because it's written in our genes, literally. Most people of non-African descent today carry about 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. That means somewhere in your family tree, one of your very, very, very great-grandparents had an Ice Age date night that got out of hand. Was it love, a survival strategy, or just a prehistoric case of, well, the gene pool's not that big? Scientists are still debating. Some encounters were probably consensual, others less so. We may never know exactly what Ice Age romance looked like, but we do know it left lasting genetic fingerprints. These traces influence traits like immune system strength, skin tone, and possibly even your mysterious hatred of cilantro. Even more fascinating, this wasn't a one-time thing. Genetic evidence shows interbreeding happened multiple times in different regions over thousands of years. So it wasn't just one confused Homo sapiens at a very dark cave party. And it didn't go only one way. Neanderthal males and Homo sapiens females seemed to pair up more often. Maybe early human storytelling skills and slightly better cheekbones played a role. Whether Neanderthals were more impressed by conversation or fire-starting skills, we'll never know. What we do know is that this mixing didn't create a hybrid superspecies. The Neanderthals eventually disappeared, but parts of them live on in us. That slightly wide nose could be a Neanderthal gift. Your love of red meat and aversion to cardio, also suspicious. Before laughing at Neanderthals for their giant brows and questionable fashion choices, check your ancestry report, because statistically speaking you might be part Neanderthal-y. No offence, it's science. Thanks to genome sequencing and the tireless efforts of geneticists armed with high-powered microscopes and too much coffee, we now know most non-African populations carry that same 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. So if your great-great-great-great-great-grandparent wore fur and didn't blink during snowstorms, congratulations, you're a little bit Ice Age. And this ancient inheritance isn't just a fun fact, it shows up in real ways. Neanderthal genes influence skin tone, hair texture, immune response, and even pain sensitivity. So if you sunburn easily, react strangely to allergens, or stub your toe and feel like you've been shot, you might have the Neanderthal edition of human firmware. There's even evidence that Neanderthal DNA affects sleep cycles, fat metabolism, and how we respond to certain medications. Some studies link it to mood regulation, meaning your winter grumpiness might actually be genetically justified. But it's not all good news. Some Neanderthal variants are tied to type 2 diabetes, depression, and nicotine addiction. So while your Ice Age ancestors might have helped you survive a mammoth ambush, they might also be responsible for your 2 a.m. snack cravings and doom-scrolling habit. Interestingly, African populations, whose ancestors didn't interbreed with Neanderthals after leaving Africa, have little to no Neanderthal DNA. But they do carry traces of other archaic humans like the Denisovans, proving humanity's family tree is less a tidy diagram and more a tangled, romantically chaotic shrub. Neanderthals thrived for nearly 300,000 years, surviving ice ages, saber-toothed predators, and each other. They were the original Europeans, the true locals. But around 40,000 years ago, they quietly vanished. No comet, no apocalypse. Just fade to black like they missed the memo about sticking around for the Holocene. What happened? One theory points to climate change. As the Ice Age ended, their environment shifted. Hunting grounds disappeared, big game grew scarce, and even mammoths started acting dramatic. For a species built to thrive in the cold, warming weather wasn't a beach vacation. It was an existential crisis. Another theory blames competition with Homo sapiens. When modern humans arrived, they brought long-range weapons, broader diets, and that annoying talent for thriving everywhere. They reproduced faster, travelled farther, and probably talked more, which in an evolutionary sense counts for a lot. Neanderthals were also fewer in number. Small isolated populations with limited genetic diversity. Not ideal when every winter feels like a survival game show, and your neighbours are breeding like it's a sport. Yet, it wasn't a violent overthrow. There's no evidence of mass conflict or extinction-level battles. If anything, Neanderthals and humans coexisted for thousands of years, trading DNA, ideas, and maybe a few awkward campfire stories, until pure Neanderthal populations simply faded away. The last known Neanderthals likely lived in southern Iberia, places like Gibraltar, holding on for a few extra millennia, the final flickers of an ancient flame. Eventually the record falls silent. No new tools, no new burials, just stillness. But that wasn't failure, it was transition. A chapter that ended, but left its mark forever. Neanderthals didn't vanish. They were absorbed. Their legacy isn't written in monuments or scrolls, but in our very DNA, our bones, our blood. For most of modern history, though, they have had terrible PR. When the first Neanderthal fossils were found in the mid-1800s, scientists didn't know what to make of them. The skull looked human-ish, but the brow ridges were massive and the limbs thick, like someone had run a person through a bulk filter. Victorian scientists, being Victorian scientists, called them brutish, primitive, and probably terrible dinner guests. Thus began the myth of the stooped, grunting caveman, part monster, part embarrassing uncle. Even the name Neanderthal didn't help. It sounded like something that might live under a bridge and throw rocks at goats. Early reconstructions made it worse. One famous model depicted a Neanderthal standing like a gorilla, with a 1,000-yard stare and no neck, which, as it's turned out, was based on an elderly individual with arthritis. That's like judging all humans based on your great-grandpa mid-back spasm. The image stuck. Cartoons, movies and textbooks repeated the stereotype. A dumb brute with a club and bad posture. Meanwhile, the evidence that Neanderthals buried their dead, created art, made tools and maybe wore jewellery was conveniently ignored. Why? Probably because it made us feel special. Humans love the idea that we're the chosen ones, the smart ones, the only ones who mattered. Reducing Neanderthals to failed prototypes helped keep that comforting narrative alive. It also made the genetic overlap a little easier to laugh off. Sure, we're related, but we're better, right? Only recently has that myth started to crumble. Archaeology and genetics have forced us to face a new reality. Neanderthals weren't mistakes. They were a parallel success. Different strategies, same struggle. In the war-torn twilight of Japan's Heian period, the battlefield was no place for a woman. And yet, that's exactly where Tomoe Gozen belonged. Picture a sea of armoured men locked in chaos, blades flashing, banners whipping through clouds of dust. And in the middle of it all, one lone figure stood out. Not because she was misplaced, but because she fought with more skill, more courage, and more precision than most men around her. Tomoe Gozen wasn't a camp follower or a noble woman pretending at war. She was a trained warrior, a musha from the province of Echigo. From childhood, she had been taught to ride, to draw a bow from horseback, and to wield a katana with such control that men twice her size fell before her. Her loyalty belonged to Minamoto no Yoshinaka, a prominent general of the Minamoto clan. But make no mistake, Tomoe wasn't just his guard or ornament. She was his commander, his equal, and his fiercest weapon. Contemporary accounts describe her as a strikingly beautiful woman, with pale skin, long black hair, and graceful features. But praise for her beauty was only a footnote beside her strength. They wrote of her unmatched archery, her mastery of the sword, and her fearlessness in battle. And these weren't poetic exaggerations, they were battlefield truths. She could split enemy lines, decapitate a rider mid-gallop, and keep moving as if death itself had trained her mandulitun. Tomoe Gozen was a storm given form, and her rise wasn't an accident. Japan was being torn apart by the Genpei War, a brutal civil struggle between the Minamoto and Taira clans for control of the imperial throne. Old codes were breaking down, the samurai class was rising, and in the middle of the chaos, Tomoe carved a place for herself that no woman had dared claim before. On the front lines, she didn't just fight, she commanded. She earned spoils, brought back severed heads as proof of victory, and defied every expectation of what womanhood meant in 12th century Japan. Tomoe Gozen wasn't an exception. She was a revelation, a warning, and the beginning of a legend. Before she ever stepped onto the battlefield, Tomo had to master survival in a world designed to shut her out. Feudal Japan was steeped in hierarchy, honour, and rigid social lines, especially for women. Daughters of samurai were expected to be polite, loyal, and silent. But Tomo's youth was anything but ordinary. Her exact birth date is unknown, but she was likely born into a minor samurai family in the late Heian era. Some sources suggest she may have been raised in Yoshinaka's household itself. Whether she was his concubine, foster sister, or loyal retainer remains debated. What isn't debated is her skill. It wasn't luck or privilege. It was earned. While young boys were handed swords and drilled in the Bushido code, Tomoe had to fight for the right to even stand beside them. Her training was relentless. Swordsmanship demanded not only strength but timing, control, and the ability to read an opponent's intent. She likely studied kenjutsu for blade work and kyudo for archery, all while learning to balance the weight of armour and guide a warhorse at full gallop. In moments of rare peace, she may have trained with the naginata, a long curved polearm often associated with women. But for Tomo, it wasn't symbolic. It was preparation for real combat. Her fighting style blended elegance and ferocity, and she didn't just keep up with the men, she surpassed them. For the legends, before the glory, her life was one of isolation. Most women didn't carry swords, most didn't attend war councils, and almost none survived long enough to earn a reputation. But Tomoe forced the world to bend around her. Every skill she gained had to be sharper, faster, and deadlier than her male peers. Because if she failed, no one would call it a soldier's error. They'd call it a woman's weakness. So before Tomoe Gozen could carve her name into history, she first had to carve her place into the samurai world, blade by blade, day by day, in silence and shadow. Not by invitation, but by sheer will. By the time Tomoe reached adulthood, Japan was collapsing into civil war. The Genpei conflict erupted in 1180 between the Taira and Minamoto clans, and it was more than a clash of armies. It was a restructuring of power itself. Emperors became pawns, and the samurai class was ready to seize control of destiny. And Tomoe was right in the heart of it. Her lord and rumoured lover, Minamoto no Yoshinaka, was a distant cousin of the more famous Minamoto no Yoritomo. But unlike Yoritomo, Yoshinaka refused to serve from the shadows. He wanted Kyoto, he wanted the Minamoto clan, and he wanted Japan, so he raised an army in the north and marched south. At his side rode Tomoe Gozen, not as a symbol, but as a leader. Tomoe led troops into combat, advised in strategy, and when battle broke, she was always in the thick of it. She embodied Yoshinaka's defiance, his willingness to upend tradition and fight by any means. The Genpei War was savage. Battles raged across rivers, mountains and fields. Arrows darkened the skies like storms, and hand-to-hand combat painted the ground red. One of Tomoe's most famous victories came at the Battle of Yokotagawara, where she led a charge that crushed enemy ranks. Chronicles claim she personally beheaded several samurai and presented their heads as proof of victory. Not for vanity, but for honour. Each kill was a declaration. But war is rarely loyal. As Yoshinaka's power grew, tensions rose with Yoritomo, who saw him as a rival. The Minamoto clan, already fractured by ambition, turned on itself. While the Taira remained the enemy on paper, Yoshinaka now had to watch his back. Tomoe, ever faithful, stayed close, but even her sword couldn't slice through politics. By 1183, Yoshinaka had achieved the impossible. He drove the Taira from Kyoto and seized the imperial court. For a brief moment, he was the most powerful man in Japan, and Tomoe stood beside him, victorious, loyal, and unyielding. But power is a double-edged blade. Yoshinaka dreamed of restoring imperial authority, yet the court quickly saw him as uncontrollable. He plundered Kyoto, alienated nobles, and even attempted to seize Emperor Go Shirakawa himself. That act doomed him. Yoritomo, now the de facto Minamoto leader, declared Yoshinaka a traitor and sent his generals, Minamoto no Noriyori and the famed Yoshitsune, to destroy him. The Minamoto civil war had begun, and Tomoe Gozen now fought against her own clan. Yoshinaka, once bold and unstoppable, found himself cornered and betrayed. He fled Kyoto with only a few loyal retainers, Tomoe among them. Their final stand came at the Battle of Awazu in early 1184. It was not a fight for victory, but for honour. As the enemy closed in, Tomoe fought like a force of nature. Chronicles say she charged the opposing lines, found the strongest warrior she could, Hatakeyama Shiotada, and cut off his head in a single stroke before riding back through chaos untouched. Even in defeat, she refused to fade quietly. But Yoshinaka knew it was over. Legend holds that he asked Tomoe to leave the battlefield, not out of doubt, but because dying beside a woman would stain his legacy. The irony was cruel. The bravest warrior at his side was dismissed to preserve his pride. Did she obey? Some say yes. Others claim she vanished into the melee, never to be seen again. Whatever the truth, Yoshinaka's death marked the end of an age, and the birth of a myth. It was February 1184. Snow covered the plains of Awazu in eerie silence. Minamoto no Yoshinaka stood with only a handful of men, once conqueror of Kyoto, now a fugitive of his own clan. Tomoe Gozen adjusted her helmet, drew her sword and charged into history. According to the 14th century Heike Monogatari, Tomoe did not retreat. She surged forward like a whirlwind, seeking her final opponent. Whether out of rage, pride, or defiance, she fought with the grace of a dying star. With one clean motion, she unseated her enemy and took his head, her last proof, her final act. This was not spectacle. It was the samurai ideal, the beauty of a perfect death, the courage to fight until the end. the will to define one's fate even as the world collapses. Tomoe Gozen's story has echoed through centuries, reshaped and retold, but its core never changed. She wasn't merely a woman who fought, she was a warrior who refused to be forgotten. Meanwhile, Yoshinaka's horse became stuck in a rice paddy, and a volley of arrows brought him down. His loyal companion, Imi Kanehira, committed suicide in dramatic fashion, placing his sword in his mouth and leaping from his horse. The warlord's inner circle had been extinguished, but here the records diverge. One version claims Yoshinaka ordered her to flee before his death, fearing the shame of dying alongside a woman. Others say she refused, fought her way out, and vanished into the mountains. Still others claim she was captured, forced to marry an enemy general, and later became a nun. None of these endings can be confirmed. One thing, however, remains certain. Her last recorded act was not one of surrender. It was one of defiance. Tomoe Gozen didn't simply disappear. She ascended into legend, carried on the back of one perfect, furious final charge. After the blood-soaked snows of Azu, Tomoe Gozen vanished from the official records, as if she rode straight off the battlefield and into myth. No historian can say for certain what happened to her, and perhaps that is fitting. Warriors like Tomoe were not meant to survive. They were expected to die with their lord, their sword, and their honour. Yet Tomoe may have chosen a far more rebellious path, to live. The Heike Monogatari, our main source on Tomoe's life, offers conflicting accounts. One claims she was captured and forced to marry Yoritomo's general, Wada Yoshimori. She bore him a child and after his death became a nun, retreating from the world of steel and politics. Another tale suggests she cut off her long warrior's hair, assumed a new identity, and vanished into the mountain monasteries of Nagano, never to be seen again. A third version hints that she continued wandering the countryside as a ronin, an unaligned warrior hired for private vengeance and border skirmishes. Then silence. Centuries of it. The truth, buried somewhere under folklore, scrolls and oral tales, may never surface. Yet Tomoe's vanishing act became part of her power. By slipping out of history, she became immortal. She was no longer confined to a single ending, role, or version of femininity. Instead, she became a symbol of possibility. What makes her story even more striking is how Japan evolved in her absence. The rise of the shogunate under Minamoto no Yoritomo marked the beginning of the Kamakura period, a rigid patriarchal era where women were increasingly sidelined. Female warriors did not vanish completely, but they were often romanticized, diminished, or erased. And yet Tomoe endured, not in the dusty scrolls of official history, but in the stories mothers told their daughters and the whispers of soldiers around campfires. She became a ghost haunting the samurai ideal, a woman who fought like 10 men but answered to no one. Over time, poets, playwrights, and artists resurrected her. Sometimes she appeared as a tragic lover, sometimes as an avenging demon, sometimes as the last true samurai, but always as a figure who defied expectations and left a trail of mystery behind her. Tomoe Gozen did not just vanish. She transformed. The silence she left behind roared louder than any battlefield death. Centuries later, the woman once feared on the battlefield became something else entirely, a legend moulded by poets, monks, and playwrights. In an era where women were expected to be invisible, Tomoe Gozen became unforgettable. The Heike Monogatari, a sweeping semi-historical war epic compiled in the 13th century, first etched her into cultural memory. But it was never just a history book. It was performance, theatre. Blind monks known as Biwa Hoshi travelled from town to town chanting the stories of the Genpei War to the sound of the biwa lute. Through their voices, Tomoe Gozen was reborn not just as a fighter, but as a tragic heroine. Later adaptations embellished her further. In No and Kabuki theatre, Tomoe became a recurring figure. Her beauty exaggerated, her loyalty dramatised, her battles stylised to perfection. She was often paired with doomed love stories, tearful farewells, and moral lessons about honour and duty. Audiences did not just watch her fight, they wept for her, admired her, and feared her in equal measure. But this romanticisation came at a cost. The real woman, the one who decapitated enemies and led cavalry charges, was gradually softened. Over time, her armour was traded for flowing kimono. Her swordplay became metaphors for feminine resilience. She became palatable, noble, tamed, yet her image refused to die. Artists throughout the Edo period painted her riding into battle, face calm, blade poised. Samurai guides included her in lists of martial paragons. Sword schools invoked her name. Even as her story was mythologized, it retained the sharp edge of the battlefield. In modern Japan, Tomoe Gozen is often mentioned alongside other legendary warriors. Musashi, Benkei, Yoshitsune, but unlike them, she carries the unique weight of gender defiance. She was not merely an exception to the rule, she was a challenge to it. In every era since, women have looked to Tomoe as proof that their place is wherever they choose to stand, even in the heart of the battlefield. The further she drifted from fact, the closer she became to symbol. A woman who should not have existed yet did. A warrior who could not be contained yet endured. A story that refused to end. Tomoe Goten's blade may have been sheathed over 800 years ago, but her presence lingers, etched not only in legend, but in the cultural psyche of Japan and beyond. As generations passed, she became more than a figure from the Genpei War. She became a symbol of resistance, individuality, and the disruptive power of a woman who refuses to follow the script. During the Edo period, when samurai culture was formalized and ritualized into a strict code, Tomoe's image was used as both inspiration and caution. Some saw her as ideal loyalty, a warrior who served her lord to the bitter end. Others, especially patriarchal scholars, saw her as a dangerous anomaly, proof that when women step beyond their prescribed role, chaos follows. Yet even those who feared her could not erase her. By the Meiji Restoration in the late 19th century, when Japan sought to modernize and define its national identity, Tomoe re-emerged in textbooks and public discourse as a patriotic heroine. She appeared in children's books, school plays, and nationalistic art, often alongside male samurai legends. The portrayals were sanitized, but the fact remained. A female warrior had made it into the canon. In the 20th and 21st centuries, Tomoe's legacy evolved once again. She became a favourite subject for manga artists, video game developers, feminist scholars, and filmmakers. In a media landscape full of cookie-cutter characters, Tomoe stood apart. Her legend was not based on romance, but on combat. She was not the lover left behind, she was the one who picked up the sword and moved forward. Modern portrayals of Tomoe reflect shifting attitudes. Some depict her as a feminist icon, others as a tragic figure of unfulfilled destiny. Some present her as a warrior spirit haunting battlefields. No matter the interpretation, she is always strong, complex, and just beyond complete understanding. Even in politics and education, Tomoe Gozen has become shorthand for defiance. Schools are named after her, martial arts dojos cite her in their lineages. She appears on stamps, posters, and in anime storylines. Her name is invoked whenever someone needs to prove that a warrior's soul can take any form. She may have fought one war, but her presence continues to rally people across every battle for identity, justice, and place. Tomoe Gozen never asked to be remembered. She left no memoirs, letters, or poetry. She left the only thing that mattered to a warrior of her age, a legacy forged in blood, loyalty, and fire. In doing so, she achieved something few in history ever manage: immortality without asking for it. Unlike many women of her time, she was preserved not because she fit society's ideals, but because she broke them. Every time she swung her blade on a battlefield swarming with men who deemed her unworthy, she rewrote the rules of feudal Japan. Though she vanished into obscurity, her absence amplified her story. In a culture where silence often defined a woman's worth, Tomoe's silence after a war became its own kind of roar. The uncertainty surrounding her fate gave generations of artists, scholars, and revolutionaries permission to fill the void with meaning. She became the embodiment of possibility, proof that one can defy structure and still become legend. Her name lives not only in literature and pop culture, but in the spirit of every woman who refuses to be invisible. Every athlete who pushes beyond her limits. Every leader told she is too bold. Every fighter who does not wait for permission to stand her ground. Tomoe Gozen is not merely historical, she is a standard bearer of defiance wrapped in silence. Today, statues of her stand in Nagano and across Japan. Schoolgirls study her in history classes, cosplayers dress as her at conventions, martial artists whisper her name as they train with the naginata. She even appears in international games and series, reminding audiences worldwide that the archetype of the female warrior is not fiction but history. Yet her greatest power may lie in the fact that we still do not fully know her. Was she a concubine turned general? A foster daughter raised in the art of war? A lone ronin who walked into the mountains and never looked back? Perhaps we will never know, but that may be the point. Tomoe Gozen was never meant to be a single story. She was meant to be many, not bound by records, not erased by time, eternally riding sword drawn into the legend she forged herself. Before satellites lit the sky and compasses pointed north, ancient mariners gazed over endless horizons and asked the boldest question: what lies beyond? They were not reckless. They were engineers, navigators, and dreamers. With little more than stars overhead and winds in their sails, they carved sea routes that would become the first arteries of global connection. Humanity's relationship with the sea began tens of thousands of years ago. Some of the earliest evidence of watercraft dates back over 40,000 years, long before the agricultural revolution. Even then, early humans used rafts to reach distant islands like Australia, crossing hundreds of miles of open ocean. These were not lucky accidents. They were deliberate journeys guided by understanding tides, winds, and celestial patterns. By 3000 BCE, maritime technology was flourishing. Cultures in Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and along the Nile were already using boats for trade and fishing. But true oceanic navigation began when certain cultures ventured into the open seas. These early mariners faced enormous challenges. They had no maps, no written instructions, and often no guarantee of return. Yet they sailed, driven by necessity, curiosity, and survival. They read the waves like a book. They observed how clouds formed over islands, how birds flew at specific times, and how the stars moved across the sky. The night sky became their greatest guide. Polaris in the northern hemisphere served as a fixed point, while in the southern hemisphere, sailors watched the Southern Cross. These seafarers learned to feel the subtle push of currents under their hulls and the sound of wind in their sails. Most impressively, they passed this knowledge orally through generations using stories and traditions. Their tools were not compasses or astrolabes, but memory, observation, and intuition. This was not mere survival, it was an early form of science. A way of understanding the world that intertwined nature and culture. By sailing into unknown waters, these ancient mariners laid the foundations for global trade, migration, and connections between civilizations that had never even known each other. Long before the rise of Athens or the glory of Rome, the island of Crete hosted one of the most sophisticated seafaring civilizations of the ancient world, the Minoans. Flourishing from around 2000 to 1450 BCE, the Minoans were more than island dwellers. They were maritime architects who transformed the sea into a superhighway of commerce, culture, and influence. At the heart of Minoan power was the city of Knossos, a sprawling palace complex adorned with vivid frescoes of dolphins, ships, and marine life. These were not mere decorations, they were statements. The Minoans lived and breathed the sea. Their economy thrived on maritime trade reaching Egypt, the Levant, and beyond. Unlike later Greek navies built for war, Minoan ships were designed for speed and stability, perfect for trade and diplomatic missions. Their vessels, often decorated with bird or bull motifs, used square sails and rowers to navigate the calm yet unpredictable Mediterranean. They carried olive oil, wine, pottery and bronze, but also ideas, art, religion and technology, spreading them like waves across the Aegean. Although no Minoan navigational charts survive, archaeologists believe they relied on star-based navigation, visual markers, coastal landmarks, watercolours, and bird flight paths. Their consistent returns from long voyages indicate a deep understanding of seasonal winds and maritime rhythms long before these were ever written down. One striking sign of Minoan maritime influence is their role in developing the Greek alphabet. Through contact with Near Eastern cultures such as the Phoenicians, the Minoans helped pave the way for one of history's most enduring scripts. But like many sea-based powers, the ocean that brought them prosperity may have also contributed to their decline. Around 1450 BCE, a volcanic eruption on the nearby island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, likely triggered tsunamis and ash clouds that devastated Minoan ports. Whether by natural disaster or invasion, their ships eventually vanished from the waves. Yet their legacy endured, demonstrating what it meant to rule by sea rather than land. If the Minoans were the artists of the sea, the Phoenicians were its tireless entrepreneurs. From around 1500 BCE to 300 BCE, city-states like Tyre, Sidon and Byblos dominated the eastern Mediterranean, not with armies but with fleets. Their legacy is one of navigation, trade and the spread of culture. The Phoenicians lacked a unified kingdom or capital, but they had ships, fast, sleek and manoeuvrable. Using sails and banks of oars, their vessels hugged coastlines or crossed open waters. Through them flowed glass, cedarwood, purple dye, and most importantly, ideas. They were the middlemen of the ancient world, linking Egypt with Anatolia, Greece with Mesopotamia, and North Africa with the Western Mediterranean. Colonies such as Carthage became vital nodes in a vast maritime network, facilitating trans-Mediterranean commerce. Like the Minoans, Phoenicians navigated using the stars, prevailing winds and coastal features. Many scholars credit them with developing one of the earliest systems of celestial navigation in the Western world. Yet their greatest contribution was the alphabet. Developed around 1050 BCE, the Phoenician writing system used just 22 characters representing sounds rather than entire words or syllables. This innovation inspired the Greek, Latin, Hebrew and Arabic alphabets. Through this linguistic leap and their seafaring skill, the Phoenicians did more than trade. They connected cultures, languages and economies, turning the sea from a barrier into a bridge. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the planet, a different maritime story unfolded. Outriggers, double-hulled canoes and star charts carried the Austronesian seafarers across the largest ocean on Earth. They colonised half the planet without metal tools, maps or written language. Originating from what is now Taiwan around 3000 BCE, they spread south and eastward, hopping from island to island with astonishing speed. By 1500 BCE, they reached the Philippines, Indonesia and New Guinea. By 1000 BE, Micronesia and Melanesia. And by the 1st century CE, Madagascar in the west and Easter Island in the east. Their vessels were marvels of engineering. Outrigger canoes provided stability, while double-hulled voyaging canoes carried families, livestock and cargo across thousands of miles of open ocean. They harnessed wind with crab claw sails and used paddles for precision near islands. But their greatest skill was navigation. Using the sun, moon, planets, and over 200 stars, Polynesian wayfinders read the ocean like a living map. They detected wave patterns, followed seabirds, observed cloud formations, and even tasted seawater to sense nearby land. This was highly refined science, passed orally through generations. Their migrations were deliberate, not random. Cultural artifacts like Lapita pottery trace their path across the Pacific, showing how interconnected their world was. They spread agriculture, languages and technology wherever they landed. Modern studies in genetics, linguistics, and archaeology continue to reveal the sophistication of Austronesian navigation. These mariners did more than cross oceans. They connected remote corners of the world long before European explorers. In the Pacific, the sea was never empty, it was a roadmap. When we think of ancient Egypt, pyramids and tombs come to mind, not ships. Yet Egyptians were expert sailors. The Nile served as their lifeline, highway and training ground. And by 3000 BCE, large wooden boats with planks lashed together transported goods, soldiers, and grain. By Hatshepsut's reign in the 15th century BCE, Egypt launched sea expeditions from Red Sea ports, most famously to Punt, bringing back exotic animals, incense and gold. These missions relied on monsoon winds, currents, coastal navigation and stars. Egyptian ships, often built from imported cedar, featured curved hulls and large square sails capable of carrying heavy loads. Though never dominant like the Phoenicians, Egyptians treated maritime expeditions as royal, sacred and strategic ventures. Far to the east, the Harappan or Indus Valley civilization 2600 to 1900 BCE thrived in what is now Pakistan and northwest India. Known for urban planning, standardized bricks and sanitation, they were also maritime traders. Excavations at Lothal revealed a dockyard linked to an ancient river flowing to the Arabian Sea. Beads, ivory and ceramics found in Mesopotamia indicate a broad trade network. Harappan boats used monsoon winds, coastal routes and celestial navigation. Remarkably peaceful, they connected regions through trade rather than conquest. Environmental changes and trade decline contributed to their fall around 1900 BCE, leaving behind maritime traces in harbours and artefacts. For the ancient Greeks, the sea was destiny. Cradled by the Aegean, Ionian and Mediterranean, Greek civilization thrived on maritime culture. Homeric epics reflected a people intimately tied to the sea. City-states like Athens and Corinth relied on trade and identity from the ocean. By the 8th century BCE, Greek colonists spread across the Mediterranean, founding trade hubs. Ships evolved into war galleys like the trireme, with 3 tiers of oars, bronze rams and crews up to 170 men. At its peak in the 5th century BCE, Athens had the most powerful navy in the ancient world. The Delian League, originally a defensive alliance, became an Athenian-led maritime empire. Naval dominance fueled Athens' golden age, but during the Peloponnesian War, reliance on the sea became a vulnerability. Greek innovations in cartography, navigation and shipbuilding influenced Roman and later European seafaring. Romans were late to the sea but quickly became dominant. Early Rome was overshadowed by Etruscans, Greeks and Carthage. During the Punic Wars, Romans captured a Carthaginian warship, reverse-engineered it, and built a massive fleet in months. They added the Corvus, a boarding bridge allowing legionaries to fight on ships like land battles. Victory over Carthage secured Mediterranean dominance and control over Sicily, Sardinia, Spain and beyond. Roman galleys patrolled sea lanes, transporting grain, troops and luxury goods. Ports like Ostia and Alexandria turned the Mediterranean into a Roman highway. The Pax Romana, lasting 2 centuries, was sustained by maritime control, stabilising trade and supplying the capital with food and exotic goods from Egypt, India and China via Red Sea and Persian Gulf routes. On land they built roads and cities, on water they created an empire. Roman sailors relied on dead reckoning, coastal navigation and celestial guidance, aided by detailed maritime itineraries known as periploi. Lacking compasses, they mastered the rhythms of wind and current, especially the Etesian winds that made return voyages in the eastern Mediterranean predictable. Rome did not merely conquer by land, it sustained itself by sea. Its navy protected trade, enforced imperial authority, and ensured communication across vast distances. With their fleets, the Romans did what no other culture had achieved. They turned the chaotic sea into a controlled empire. Long before modern maps, compasses or engines, the ancient world was connected by an invisible lattice of sea routes. drawn not with ink, but with wind, memory, and stars. From the reed boats of the Nile to the double-hulled canoes of the Pacific, early maritime cultures did more than explore, they defined the seas. Their legacy lingers in every port, trade route, and ship that crosses the waves today. Knowledge passed down by Minoans, Phoenicians, Austronesians, Egyptians, and others became the foundation of future navigation. These cultures learned to read the sky as a map, sail with the Earth's rhythms, and build ships capable of months at sea, all without metal hulls or written charts. Their discoveries were cumulative. Each seafaring civilization learned from predecessors or neighbours, adding new threads to the tapestry of global navigation. Phoenician alphabets enabled record-keeping for complex trade. Austronesian oral navigation inspired 20th century efforts to revive wayfinding without instruments. Greek observations of stars and wind shaped early geography. Roman engineering produced ports and lighthouses echoed in modern harbour design. Even more significant than the tools were the connections they enabled. Maritime routes transported ideas faster than armies, spreading religions, technologies, crops, languages, and even diseases. The maritime cultures of the ancient world moved civilizations, not just goods. Without them, ancient trade networks would have stalled at coastlines. Empires might never have risen, and distant peoples might have remained strangers forever. Yet for all their accomplishments, many early sailors remained nameless. Their stories were rarely written. Their ships decayed and vanished. What survives are fragments, pottery shards in sunken cargo holds, port structures buried under modern cities, star maps etched on bone or bark. Still, their impact moves with the tide. Every container ship in the Suez Canal, every satellite-guided cargo run across the Pacific, every naval patrol in the Mediterranean owes something to those first brave souls who chased the horizon. They were ancient but never primitive. They were the original navigators of human history. In the ancient world, royal birth was both a blessing and a curse. From the moment a child was born into a palace, they became more than a person, a symbol, a political instrument, and the future of an empire. Their education began not in classrooms, but in nurseries filled with whispers of lineage, legacy, and looming threats. Unlike common children who learned survival through labour, elite children were groomed for leadership from birth. Every gesture and word was watched, corrected, and shaped. Life was a rehearsal for thrones they had not yet earned. They did not read for pleasure, but to interpret treaties. They did not speak for expression, but to command obedience, recite laws, and deliver carefully measured flattery to foreign envoys. Curriculum varied by geography and dynasty, but the goals were universal: control, charisma, and continuity. Babylonian princes trained under scribes in uniforms, Egyptian heirs learned priestly hieroglyphs and sacred myths, Greek princes studied philosophy, Persian heirs mastered etiquette and military skill, and Chinese princes followed Confucian doctrine. Even their toys reflected politics. Miniature weapons, strategy games, and symbolic animals reinforced the roles they were expected to master. Tutors were not mere teachers. They were handlers, loyal and elite, often expendable. Failure of a royal student could ruin a tutor, while success brought recognition only if the pupil made history. Aristotelian tutoring of Alexander the Great remains the most famous example. Aristotle taught ethics, rhetoric, zoology, geography, and philosophy, shaping the mind of a future conqueror. Roman tutors, like Seneca with Nero, could not always prevent disastrous outcomes, demonstrating the limits of influence. Persian tutors trained young princes in archery, riding, and morality, preparing future satraps and generals. In China, Confucian scholars instilled hierarchy, ritual, and piety, under threat of severe punishment for error. Royal tutors lived in the shadows, shaping history through the words and deeds of their students. Behind every powerful ruler were often these obscure figures: philosophers, priests, generals, and political operatives or mimratives. In Egypt, priesthoods guarded education, instructing future pharaohs in hieroglyphs, religious texts, rituals, astronomy and medicine. Literacy was sacred, reserved for those destined to govern or interpret the divine. Temples such as those at Karnak or Heliopolis operated as secret schools where knowledge was closely guarded. Instruction was political as much as religious. Mastering omens, spells and rituals gave rulers control over life and death in the eyes of their people. Persian princes attended hidden royal schools, learning truth-telling, horsemanship, archery and leadership alongside Zoroastrian ethics and statecraft. In India, royal children sometimes studied in gurukulas, secluded schools run by learned Brahmins. Across civilizations, royal education was not personal development. It was survival of regimes and control of knowledge, the most powerful tool of all. While commoners rarely had access to formal instruction, princes were often placed under the guidance of a single guru who taught them everything from Vedic hymns to martial skills. Their education was holistic, spiritual, intellectual and physical, and deeply hierarchical. Knowledge was tailored to caste, role and destiny. Even in Greece, where education was more democratized in some cities, elite children received specialized training. Spartan royal sons were enrolled in the agou, the state-run military academy, while Athenian aristocrats hired private tutors in logic, strategy and rhetoric. Knowing how to win a war was only half the battle. Knowing how to win an argument could be equally critical. In all these worlds, knowledge was not simply taught. It was guarded, passed like a sword meant only for those capable of wielding it. In the ancient world, royal women were rarely expected to lead armies or govern states, but their education was never trivial. Across many dynasties, the instruction of elite daughters was as calculated and strategic as that of their brothers. Royal women were not only daughters, they were future queens, priestesses, political pawns, and sometimes power players. In Egypt, queens like Hatshepsut and Nefertiti did more than stand beside pharaohs. They ruled, built temples, and engaged in diplomacy, requiring rigorous training. Egyptian princesses learned hieroglyphs, religious texts, estate management, and sacred rituals. Those destined to become the god's wife of Amun were initiated into priestly orders, studying rites and theology far beyond the reach of commoners. Some even participated in governance with knowledge equal to that of male counterparts. In Persia, royal women were kept behind palace curtains but were far from idle. Achaemenid queens managed vast estates, supervised treasuries, and maintained court alliances, mastering bookkeeping, diplomacy, and political etiquette. Greek historians like Xenophon note how Persian queens exercised behind-the-scenes governance, reflecting a quiet yet formidable education. In ancient Greece, women's education varied. Athenian elites were trained in domestic skills such as music, weaving, and household management, while in Sparta, royal daughters were raised for strength. Spartan women practiced physical fitness, rhetoric, and Spartan values, allowing them to manage estates and command respect even while men were at war. In India and China, noble women's education reflected religious and dynastic priorities. In the Gupta Empire, royal daughters studied Sanskrit, music, poetry, and philosophy to enhance their status and influence. In imperial China, empresses and consorts learned Confucian ethics, calligraphy, and palace protocol. Women destined for political roles, such as Empress Lu Ji or Wu Zetian, mastered governance, surveillance, and statecraft under the guise of etiquette. Royal women navigated a delicate path. Expected to charm rather than rule, they often stepped into power when circumstances demanded it, and their education became their arsenal. If swords won battles, words won empires. In the ancient world, elite children were trained to speak not for pleasure, but as a weapon. Language, rhetoric, and public persuasion were essential for rule, diplomacy, and survival. In Greece, rhetoric was the hallmark of a civilized leader. Athenian aristocrats studied under masters like Isocrates and later sophists, practicing persuasive speech as both art and science. Young elites delivered speeches, debated in public forums, and mastered logos, pathos, and ethos, the pillars of classical persuasion. For rulers, a sharp tongue could be more powerful than a sharp blade. This ideal spread across cultures. In Rome, elite boys studied oratory from a young age, memorizing Cicero's speeches, learning courtroom strategy, and practicing arguments with poise. For imperial heirs, eloquence was survival. A poorly timed phrase could provoke scandal, while a brilliant speech could sway the Senate. Even in monarchies with absolute power, words mattered. Egyptian pharaohs were divine speakers, and royal children learned ceremonial language and formulas for rituals and public proclamations. In Mesopotamia, scribal schools trained elite children to write persuasively, crafting royal decrees, diplomatic letters, and hymns. In Persia and India, language played equally vital roles. Persian princes studied multiple tongues, Old Persian for court, Aramaic for diplomacy, and occasionally Greek or Median, learning to negotiate, flatter, and intimidate with precision. Indian royal students under the Maurya and Gupta empires studied Sanskrit epics and texts like the Arthashastra, learning tactics, diplomacy, and espionage. Even in oral cultures, such as Celtic and Germanic societies, storytelling and speech were forms of authority. A prince who could not speak well could not lead. Power ultimately was spoken into existence. For ancient royals, the sky was not merely a canvas of stars. It served as a calendar, compass, clock, and sometimes divine script. Mathematics and astronomy were foundational, shaping rulers' understanding of time, taxes, architecture, war, and destiny. In Mesopotamia, long before Pythagoras, Babylonian elites studied base 60 mathematics, predicted eclipses, and calculated planetary movements with precision. Royal scribes and astronomers instructed princes in reading tablets filled with data on stars, weather, and omens. These calculations guided decisions on warfare, agriculture, and rituals. Egyptian royals similarly integrated mathematics into governance. Pharaohs measured land for taxation, oversaw monumental constructions, and managed temples and pyramids, requiring geometry and logistics. Astronomy dictated the religious calendar, and princes tracked the heliacal rising of Sirius to mark the Nile's inundation and the start of the year. In India, royal students studied texts like the Sulba Sutras and Aryabhatas, works on algebra and planetary motion, linking science with ritual timing. A wise king consulted the stars, and an educated king interpreted them. Greek royal education combined mathematics with philosophy, teaching rulers to understand the cosmos and their place within it. Alexander the Great studied arithmetic and astronomy alongside ethics and logic under Aristotle. Chinese emperors, seen as cosmic intermediaries, were educated in lunar cycles, eclipses, and calendar reform. Across civilizations, educated rulers wielded authority over people, time, space, and destiny. Education extended beyond classrooms to battlefields. Courage, physical skill, and strategy were as crucial as philosophy and statecraft. Elite children, particularly male heirs, learned the unspoken truth. If you cannot defend your kingdom, someone else will. Spartan princes entered the Agoge by age 7, trained in endurance, combat, and battlefield tactics. Persian princes mastered riding, archery, and hunting, blending skill with the strategy. Indian warrior classes trained young royals in martial science, studying weapons and military philosophy through epics like the Mahabharata. Egyptian and Mesopotamian princes practiced chariotry, spear throwing, and wrestling under military instructors. Roman patricians trained in virtue and discipline, balancing scholarship and martial skill. Julius Caesar exemplified this dual education. Chinese princes practiced martial arts, archery, and horsemanship, embodying the civil-military ideal. Warfare education was survival. Misplaced words, glances, or gestures could trigger conflict. Etiquette was strategy. Royal children learned precision, restraint, and political reading of every room. From China to Persia, courtly behaviour was codified. In Han China, princes memorized ritual codes governing greetings, mourning, and conduct. In Persia, royal children mastered dress, manners, diplomacy, and indirect communication to navigate intrigue. In India, Nati Shastra instructed heirs in political strategy, espionage, and diplomacy. Greek and Roman elites learned charm, public conduct, and influence, training to sway senators, undermine rivals, and then interpret ambition. In Egypt, etiquette merged with divinity. Royal children embodied cosmic order through posture and presence. Espionage underpinned education. Princes learned loyalty testing, information gathering, and deception detection. Survival depended on surveillance. Royal education was never merely child-rearing, it shaped dynasties. Every lesson in logic, battle, etiquette, and language carried the weight of generations. A well-educated ruler could unite kingdoms and stabilize empires. A poorly trained one could unravel them. Education was an empire's wager on itself, with immense stakes for every child, prince, princess, or heir. Alexander the Great's conquests were rooted in tailored instruction under Aristotle, blending knowledge, debate, and ambition. Nero, trained by Seneca, illustrates that education alone could not prevent failure. Royal women's education was equally critical. Queens and princesses like Cleopatra or Wu Zetian mastered languages, treasury management, and court politics, ensuring survival and influence. The impact of these educations endured through patronage, libraries, and institutionalized learning, shaping future generations. In the ancient world, thrones were inherited, but the ability to keep them had to be taught.